Well, it's a delight to be here. I've been discovering slow, and you have a little paradise here, which is wonderful to at least see from the outside, even though I'm not going to be able to stay and be a part of it. And I'd like to just say a few things about the format this afternoon. We're a relatively small group, and what I would like to do, often when Christian Science churches decide to have one of these events, it's called a lecture. But that's not a term that people enjoy today. Somehow people don't like to be lectured to. And as a result, they usually look for another term to use. Talk, symposium, seminar, all these terms. That avoids the idea of being lectured to. But what I'd like to suggest that we can do this afternoon is think together. And frankly, we're going to be dealing with some kind of difficult issues. I've been already warned one of the questions that's a little bit challenging that's going to be coming up. But in this whole issue of resolving conflict in today's world is a real challenge. And I'm going to suggest what I think is a logical sequence of ideas that you may not always agree with. We're a small enough group together so that if you would like to raise your hand and ask a question during the presentation. And what are we going to call that presentation? I'd like to call it a think, because we're going to be thinking together, and that's the whole point. We're going to be reasoning together. I'm going to be doing most of the talking, but if we're together, then we'll, I think, arrive at a conclusion that's going to be a little bit revolutionary, maybe a lot revolutionary. Agreed that you'll be willing to raise questions if there's a break in the logic? Yep. Thanks. Conflict is, it seems to be all over today. I think there's a difference between the way in which we were conscious of conflict a generation or maybe 2 generations ago. 2 generations ago, we learned about the conflict that was going on in the world. Usually, there was that hour news in the evening, and we heard about what happened that day or the day before. Today, we're with the conflict. We're in it. We're either embedded as a journalist and the bullets are whizzing by, but it's not just in the evening. It's 24/7 news on TV, on the internet, and unfortunately, the news media, just as a couple generations ago, still today, even the responsible news media use the basic idea, if it bleeds, it leads. And as a result, what we see is the worst. And we see it over and over and over again. And so we have the impression there's greater conflict. And there's kind of a reaction, how do we protect ourselves? Building walls and all that sort of thing. And in fact, the experts, especially on violence, tell us that there's less conflict today. That in fact, over the past century, there's been a consistent gradual decrease, at least in the amount of violent conflict. Even though the world seems actually the opposite to us today. But there is something that has been added to this contemporary world, especially here in the United States, but to some degree around the world, and that is ideological conflict. We have this rigidification of the polarization that's taking place in the United States today. And as a result, we have taking positions, usually rigid, uncompromising, in such a way that finding solutions to conflict seems to become more difficult. Well, okay, so this is kind of the context in which I want to explore how we can be dealing with these very issues. This question of, is there anything that the man in the street can do with regard to this conflict came up in a conversation between an Indian Cherokee chief and a questioner. The questioner asked that very question, is there something that the man in the street can do? And the chief answered that for him, inside of each one of us are two wolves fighting. There's the good wolf, the wolf of kindness, generosity, love, compassion. There's the bad wolf, the wolf of jealousy, vengeance, violence. Well, the questioner asked which wolf is going to win. And the chief answered, the one you're feeding. I think that's a profound answer, a simple but profound answer. And I'd like to really explore just how we can feed the good wolf. I'd like to do this afternoon. I would like to look at three different arenas of conflict at different levels. The first, at the community level. This is one which I was involved with. The second, at a kind of national, supranational level. And the third, just the simple interface that we have with within a family, person to person. And one of the things I want to be focusing on is, of course, how we can deal with this spiritually, but from the standpoint of ourselves, just individuals who don't have any special positions in our society or our community, but just each individual, what we can do. The issue, this particular issue, is there anything that the man in the street can do, came up in an interesting interview. This took place a number of years ago in Europe. An Interpol officer, Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization, this Interpol officer was being interviewed about a book that he'd written, and the interviewer asked him that question that I've been referred to several times, namely, is there anything that the man in the street can do with regard to the issues of conflict in our society? And it was clear that the interviewer was expecting a fairly definite no. You have to be a part of Interpol or some organization. And yet, the Interpol officer's answer was a very definite yes. There is something. And it turns out that he had been doing research with regard to the mafia taking over mid-sized European city governments, not just in Italy, in all of Western Europe. And what he'd found was that there was a kind of a definite correspondence between the thinking of the population of the city and the ability of the mafia to take over. He said, in those communities where there was already a kind of mafioso spirit, that is a concern primarily for one's extended family, disconcern with anything else. That was the kind of city where at least a part of the city government was taken over by the mafia. And on the contrary, in those communities where there was a sense of willingness to volunteer for city tasks, and especially a respect for the integrity of the city itself, it was almost as though, as he explained it, the mafia could feel that. And either they didn't try, or if they did try, they failed in those communities where that kind of thinking was present. Well, when I heard this, all kinds of bells were going off in my thought. And I realized that what he was saying was almost identical to a point that Christ Jesus was making in his Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Sermon on the Mount, many of you probably know what it is. It's something which Bible scholars tell us is the way in which one of the biographers of Jesus put together in a coherent way the core teachings of Jesus. And this is St. Matthew, who in his biography, there are 3 chapters which are called the Sermon on the Mount. And in them, Jesus talks about this question of the importance of what we're thinking. he begins with a set of what are called beatitudes, where he talks about simply mental attitudes that he feels are important. And then he goes on and he talks about what he feels is a misinterpretation of he's a Jew, of the law. The law is crucial to Jews, and for Jesus this was absolutely crucial that the accurate understanding of the law be present. And what he noticed was that the understanding of the Ten Commandments had to do with behavior. At least that's what people thought. He said, no, you've got it wrong. And, if you think about it, I think we've got it wrong too. We tend to, just as the 2,000 years ago, the people thought that when you heard thou shalt not, or thou shalt do this or that, it was referring to behavior, what you're supposed to do. But Jesus pointed out the behavior isn't unimportant, but it's secondary. The crucial thing is what you're thinking. What do you have in your thought? And that's exactly what the law has to do with, knowing that the thinking controls the behavior. And so Jesus takes an example. He takes the seventh commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And he explains that if you have lust in your thought, you've already broken the commandment. He takes the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And he indicates that if you are angry with anyone, you've already broken the commandment. And then he goes on, and he reaches kind of the high point, at least to me, of the Sermon on the Mount, where he talks about essentially how we can love. What is the basis of loving? And again, he indicates something that is present in the thought of the individuals of his day, 2,000 years ago, I think equally present in our thinking, and that is that when we love, when we think we're loving our family, we're loving our friends, we're loving those people that we're able to deal amicably with. And he says, you know what? The worst people in society do that. That's not loving. He indicates, in fact, the worst people in the society of his day were the publicans, the name for the traitors, the Jews who were cooperating with the Roman tax collectors. And in the process, not only enriching the Romans, but enriching themselves. And he says, love is something totally different. And then he explains what the real essence of love is, and he comes to that high point in the Sermon on the Mount when he identifies the key to our love, being able to love, and that's when we can love our enemies. And he says this, he puts it in fairly emphatic and dramatic terms. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you. This wasn't a minor point that he was making. This was something which he had been building up to, and which really, in his thought, is crucial. But can we love someone we've already identified as an enemy? I don't think it's possible. Well, let's put that aside just for the moment, because I want to come back to that. And I want to describe, first of all, what I indicated, namely resolving conflict at the community level. And I'm going to take us back, way, way back. Tanya mentioned that period. This was the late 60s. And it was a time I've just recently heard it described as kind of the moment of the greatest turmoil in the world, and at least in the past 60, 70 years. And it's kind of interesting. This wasn't just the case in the United States. It was all over the world. In France, if you're a 68er, you're a part of the revolution. And there were a lot of revolutions going on within the realm of civil rights, it was the time of the Vietnam War, within the whole anti-war movement. Women's rights were coming to the fore in a way in which they'd never come before that time. And I was involved with this. I was very interested in civil rights. My mentor was Martin Luther King Jr. I had just moved, as Tanya indicated, from Princeton to Pittsburgh, taking up a new position in the city. And I discovered that the city council of my new city was racist in very explicit terms. The first thing I learned was that one of the city councilors had rejected a proposition of a contract with a African-American enterprise on the basis, the reason he gave for rejecting the contract was that they were black. This wasn't politically correct at all, and he knew he didn't need to be, because he was within the whole context of a racist group of individuals. And I learned more about that during the fall and the winter, and I came to a point where I hated that individual. I hated their policies, and I felt totally justified. These were bad people. They deserved my hate. So I was enjoying this hatred. I really was. I felt totally in the right, self-righteous, admittedly, but that was my mental attitude. And spring of 1968 came, and Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. My city, Pittsburgh, burst into the worst racial conflict in its history. Really horrible. Massive loss of life, loss of property. National Guard was called out in the most severe circumstances of any city, and there were lots of city riots at that time, that the country had known. 10 days, curfew of 4:30, you couldn't go out of your home. It was bad. And I didn't grow up in Christian Science, but I had, at that point, belonged to the Christian Science church in my city. It turns out that one of the trustees of the church was a city councilor and was African American. And seeing the destruction in the city and the great need to somehow come together, he proposed that our church invite the political leaders, his own fellow city councilors and the mayor, the economic leaders, the CEOs of the large corporations, the academic leaders of the large universities. And the church agreed to call a meeting with all these individuals and to call it Love Leads the Way. They asked me to chair the meeting, and I agreed. And now I had a problem. And it's kind of interesting. I knew very clearly the very basis of the religion that I had become a part of just 12 or 15 years before was love. In fact, Mary Baker Eddy, the founder of the religion, describes the heart and soul of Christian Science as love. And in her writings, you can hardly go more than 2 or 3 pages without running into the consciousness of that valuing of love as a power, not just a power, as the power, greater power than the most fearful weapon of mass destruction. And what I had been able to do is what psychologists call maintenance. It's a maintenance of totally contradictory ideas in my thought. And as long as I didn't bring them too close together, I was perfectly comfortable. Enjoying hating these city councilors, recognizing that divine love was the greatest power in the world. But now I had what psychologists call, when these two ideas come into conflict with one another, I was experiencing cognitive dissonance. Big time. And a good friend noticed that I was wrestling with this problem. And he said, John, imagine that individual that you hate the most, imagine that individual asked you to pray for him. Well, I recognized immediately that's the answer. And you see, what I had learned in Christian Science, I'd learned really a different form of prayer than I had known before, and a form of prayer which is turning to God, but it's not so much asking God to do something as an attempt to understand, as an attempt to bring into consciousness, now this is praying for a specific individual, an accurate picture or understanding of that individual. And one of the things that I knew I had to do was, it's kind of as though we all have facades, and there was this physical picture I had of this individual, so I knew I had to push that facade out of the way so that I could begin to see the individual's real nature. Now, this mental process is based on a very simple logic, the idea that there's a perfect creator, what John, one of Jesus' students, calls love itself, love, that this creator is the basis of every characteristic of its creation. It's not a mixture of other things, and it's especially not a mixture of matter and spirit, kind of, which is the picture of the nature of man that the world teaches us. You know, that we're basically a physical body mixed in with a thinking mechanisms, some spiritual sense, a moral sense, and so forth. It's really a rejection of that picture in order to be able to sense the pure godlike nature of God's creation. So that if I'm praying for an individual, I'm sensing spiritually, I'm really getting rid of all of the physical sense information that comes to me about that individual. And I'm bringing into consciousness his spiritual nature. Sensing spiritually is a concept that it's a little bit challenging, and I want to just explain a little bit further what it is, because it's I think, crucial in solving conflict as well as praying in other ways. I'd like you to imagine a situation in which you have an opportunity to speak very briefly with two individuals who are not twins, but they look very much alike. They're the same age, same gender, same race, same build. And you have an opportunity to speak with them, let's say, for 5 minutes. You come away from that conversation recognizing that one of the two, you're kind of on the same wavelength. It was a superficial 5-minute conversation, but you still felt something, that the kind of individual you could get along with and probably trustworthy. The other, not so much. Not the kind of person you'd want to leave holding your wallet while you go swimming. Now, you probably haven't had that exact experience, but I'm sure you've had many similar experiences. Experiences in which you've been able to communicate, and the way I set that up was so that there wouldn't be anything physical that communicated to you that what you were sensing. But there was something which allows you to sense these qualities in individuals. And that's spiritual sense. Jesus didn't have a term for it, but it's quite clear in his teaching of his students that what he wants them to do is to understand, first of all, they have a spiritual sense. And second, that they need to use it consciously and as consistently as possible. And why does he do that? Because that's the basis of their being able to follow his example in learning how to heal. You can tell that this is very important to him because it's the element about which he he reacts most strongly in his teaching of his students. And I say this from quite a number of years teaching. I know when I get most frustrated with my students, it's not when they are not able to understand the superficial aspects. It's when they've missed the core, the really most important element that is going to enable them to understand the rest of the subject. And especially when we've gone over it and over it and over it. And Jesus had gone over and over. He trained his students. You see, the language that he used, just as the language that we use, grows out of material experience, not spiritual experience. And so it's a crude tool. One we use, it's one we have to use because there are not too many other tools with regard to communication. But if he could communicate to his students that he wanted them to use this spiritual sense, and then show them how he could do that by example in his own healing and by explanation, by precept, then he would be successful in enabling them to do the same things he did, to heal as he did. And you can tell there's several points in his teaching where this comes out really clearly. One of them is a moment when he's set up, he's given a rendezvous to his students. He's going to meet them later in the evening. And the students have worked out a procedure whereby one of them is responsible for bringing the bread for the meal. He's been talking with the Pharisees, and he's kind of excited. He wants to communicate that idea that they should beware of the false thinking of the Pharisees. And he's trained them to understand he's going to use symbols, and he does constantly, parables and metaphors and so forth, to communicate, kind of overcoming the difficulty of not having a spiritual language. So he wants them to understand that they should beware of this false thinking. But they're conscious of the fact that this individual who was responsible for bringing the bread forgot the bread. And so he comes to them excited with this idea, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And they say, oh, leaven. He's upset because someone forgot the bread. And Jesus loses it. And you can really feel, eyes ye have, and ye see not. Ears ye have, and ye hear not. Now, it's not their physical eyes or ears he's talking about. It's their spiritual sense. He wants them to use it. He wants them to use it constantly. That's the means by which they're eventually going to be able to do the same things he did, to heal physical and other kinds of problems. And so that spiritual sense is crucial, and I knew that this was a part of what was involved if I were going to pray for someone. I need to bring that spiritual sense. And I was successful in at least mentally pushing aside that physical picture of this individual. But there was another picture, and that was what I call the historical picture. That was my memory of that individual advocating policies that I thought were hateful, disastrous, and I was associating them with him. How could I get through that, break through that barrier? Well, as it happens, I discovered a little essay that Mary Baker Eddy had written just 80 years before. She wrote quite a number of books. This is from one of the books called Miscellaneous Writings. And the very beginning of that essay, called Love Your Enemies, there are three, I'm just going to read three questions, the first three sentences. Who is thine enemy that thou shouldest love him? Is it a creature or a thing outside thine own creation? I was creating my enemies? Well, the third sentence, which is a question, confirms that. She says, can you see an enemy except you first formulate this enemy and then look upon the object of your own conception? I was creating my enemies. That was my answer. And I realized that's exactly what I had done. I had identified these characteristics, associated them kind of indissolubly with the individual, and now I had an enemy. And that enabled me, in a sense, to deconstruct my enemy, to recognize that wasn't a part of his identity. That had nothing to do with him. It wasn't that within the human realm it was unimportant, but if I were to identify him accurately, if I were to sense spiritually who he really was, then I could push that facade aside just as I was able to push the physical picture of him aside. Well, it wasn't that I suddenly understood that completely, but I was really quite a ways moving in the direction of understanding that when the meeting took place. We didn't solve all the problems of the city in this meeting called Love Leads the Way. We did begin with some. The dean of the business school of the University of Pittsburgh recognized that they had never been interested in the black entrepreneurs in the city, and that they had the expertise with which to help them. And they began an institute, still in effect today, which has been helping those entrepreneurs. And it was also the context within which I realized that there was a need. This is a period of time when there was a discovery on the part of African Americans that the policy that had existed in their regard to solving the racial problem in the United States, policy of integration, had failed totally. Couldn't be trusted for anything. And so they wanted kind of complete separation. And it was the beginning of the Africana studies programs at the University of Pittsburgh and all over the country. What I saw was the need to have some balance between exclusion and the failure of the inclusion. And so I proposed this, what, as Tanya mentioned, is called an intercultural house. The university thought it was an exciting idea. The 5 vice chancellors all accepted and congratulated me and thought that the university could support it. 4 of them came to me privately and said that wonderful as the idea was, it would never succeed. Either it would be firebombed within the first 6 months, or such pressure would be put on the African American students that they would withdraw and the project would collapse. That was 48 years ago. It's still in existence. And interestingly enough, we had quite a number of problems in establishing it. We identified a building that we were going to renovate. We need to have variances. The city government needed to cooperate with us. And in particular, we wanted it to be tax exempt. Big problem. But there was an individual who came to our rescue, that city councilor. He became our most steadfast helper. And for the first 25 years of the existence of this project, he was our defender. And he became a good friend. And for me, it was a good illustration of overcoming conflict using a spiritual approach.
John, do you mind reading those 3 questions again?
Not at all. So the question is, those 3 questions at the beginning of Mary Baker Eddy's essay, Love Your Enemies. Who is thine enemy that thou shouldst love him? Is it a creature or a thing outside thine own creation? Can you see an enemy except you first formulate this enemy and then look upon the object of your own conception? Well, we've looked at this first example, and I haven't mentioned an element which is actually crucial if we're going to deal with conflict resolution, absolutely essential. And Jesus recognized how essential this element was. In fact, he was training his students to put it into practice. And it turns out it's very difficult. It's extraordinarily difficult. And the noisiest of his students, Peter, who usually pipes up when there's great difficulty, complained. And he said, is it okay if I just try 7 times? Knowing it was that difficult. And I'll bet you know what quality it is that Peter was having difficulty with. Any suggestions? Forgiveness. Yes. You know your Bible. Yes, it's forgiveness, and it is difficult. But it's also absolutely necessary. Jesus answered that, can I try 7 times to, I say unto thee, not until 7 times, but until 70 times 7. And that doesn't mean when you've reached the 491st time that you're off the hook. That meant, in Jesus' way of speaking, you cannot not do this. This is essential. And what has been tremendously comforting to me in the past generation is to see that this is being recognized by the world. Courses in conflict resolution now include forgiveness as an important part of the course. And it turns out that in practically every culture, forgiveness has a significant role. And for example, in Sierra Leone, where there's enormous conflict, they will have taken that concept as it exists in a different language and used it as a basis for bringing together those elements which have been at war with one another. In fact, I was giving this same lecture not too long ago at the University of Wisconsin, and they have, within the context of their peace studies program, developed it's the IFI, the International Forgiveness Institute. So it's something which is recognized, and of course it is very important. The problem is that it doesn't go far enough. And wonderful as this emphasis on what I call human forgiveness is, there's what Jesus is talking about takes us further, takes us beyond the realm of just, well, let me give you a definition, at least as used by some of these programs, forgiveness programs. To forgive is to stop feeling anger, to grant pardon for remission of an offense. It's also a conscious decision to release feelings of resentment, vengeance toward a person or group, regardless of deserving forgiveness. Now, this is wonderful. This is so much better than vengeance that one can't but feel just delighted that this has become important in the context of teaching conflict resolution. But if we want real resolution, we need to go further. And just the reason I started out with that example of what I learned in the Pittsburgh case is that we need to go to the point where we're becoming conscious of the spiritual identity, of the real divine nature of the individual or the group that we're forgiving. In other words, we're not taking into account the human behavior that we leave essentially to human institutions to deal with. It's not that we're pardoning horrible acts. We have institutions that are able to deal with them. But we're dealing with consciousness, with our thinking, and what we're doing within that context, our mental picture of the individuals. And you see, this is how, taking from the back burner where we put that issue, about loving enemies. Now you can see what we can do, and this is what Eddie points out. We can deconstruct our enemy. we can take away those misconceptions that we have applied in our own thought to that individual, such that we can arrive at the point where we're able to sense spiritually their godlike nature. And what's wonderful about this is that it not only enables us to come to the point of forgiving, but it enables us to come to the point of healing. And this is, as Tanya mentioned, this think that we're dealing with this afternoon is within the context of a program, Healing 101. So this becomes perhaps the central and most important element. Using spiritual sense to discover, really, to be able to perceive or sense accurately the real nature of the would-be enemy. And in that way, taking away these misconceptions and enabling us to sense spiritually the pure godlike nature. And you know, these divine qualities that we're now able to sense as a real part of that individual are beautiful. It's impossible not to love that individual if we've removed all of the misconceptions. Now we're seeing God, the image and likeness of God. And that's healing. It's also arriving at the point where it's forgiving, because we're now able to love the would-be enemy. Okay. You're driving down 101, good law-abiding citizen that you are, and enjoying the beautiful California landscape. And then suddenly, some cowboy comes zipping past you and suddenly pulls in front of you, puts on the brakes. You have to slam on the brakes. And I don't know about you, my first reaction is often, stupid idiot. Well, actually, usually a little bit stronger than that. Now the question is, do we forgive the stupid idiot? No. This is the thing. We need, you see, that's the whole point of deconstructing. We need to revise our picture that may be the first thing that we react to into what is true about that individual. We need to sense spiritually that person's real godlike nature. That's what we do mentally. The consequences are going to be very different, but they're going to be blessing, whatever they are. Forgiveness in the second half of the 20th century was not something that could be applied to one country. I want to I know some of you have lived through this, as I have, but I want to just kind of give you a 2-minute description of the context of the second half of the 20th century in terms of human rights. And very simply, it was one in which the bulk of the population of the world was moving in the direction of increased acknowledgement of human rights as an important question. It wasn't a continually smooth curve upwards. There was lots of ups and downs. But the general movement, dissolution of the French and British empires, new countries gaining freedom, so forth, the movement was pretty much in the same direction, except for one country, South Africa. In 1948, a new government came in, and for that period, second half of the 20th century, it was moving pretty rapidly in the opposite direction. Apartheid, this idea of the need for the separation of races, became the policy. It was known as the apartheid government. And there wasn't anything that the world could do. It was slow. The rest of the world was slow to react, but gradually they put on pressure. And it seemed as though every time there was greater pressure put on the government to go in the other direction, they went further in the wrong direction. The reaction on the part of black Africans in South Africa, this was just a context of a country more than 80% black, so less than 20% white. But the the policies were development of concentration camps, conscious exploitation, and massive reaction massacres when the blacks reacted. It was so bad that I couldn't find anyone who could imagine anything other than the bloodiest revolution as a result of all this that the world had ever known. And interestingly, I got to know quite a number of South Africans in the area of Pennsylvania where I lived, who all recognized that same thing. These individuals all had spent time in South African jails. And it was fascinating to me because there was a sense of forgiveness in their mental approach to the problem. They saw how horrible it was, and yet there wasn't that condemnation, sense of the need for vengeance and so forth. And this was characterized, interestingly, by South Africans who were still in the country, Desmond Tutu in particular, but others of his nature. He won the 1984 Nobel Peace Prize. And in his acceptance speech, he indicated that a life without forgiveness isn't a life worth living. And this wonderful mental attitude was present among these individuals that I was describing were friends in Western Pennsylvania. And they recognized that, okay, there was going to be this horrid revolution, but there needed to be something for afterwards, some constitutional framework of perhaps identifying the way in which rights could be distributed equitably for afterwards. And they asked me, I had taught constitutional law, I was active in civil rights, they asked me to help them in formulating this post-revolutionary government. I shared some of the insights that I'd gained from that earlier experience in Pittsburgh. And the leader, Dennis Brutus, a wonderfully sensitive individual, was fascinated by what I've described as spiritual forgiveness, not just human forgiveness. And he gathered together the other individuals who were working on this project, and we spent evenings together talking about spiritual forgiveness. It was a wonderful period. And we recognized as well, not only was there going to be a need for this sort of legal framework, but there was going to be a need for reconciliation of one kind. This is a society where there were just terrible rents in the social fabric. And so we explored the possibility of an organization. In fact, we'd found an example of a court which had worked to be able to grant pardon on the basis of an individual's desire for forgiveness, within which an institution within which pardon could be granted if the circumstances which had provoked that for which he needed to be pardoned to occur. Well, while we were working on this project, what for me is the greatest miracle of the 20th century took place. The government of South Africa had just gained a new president, F.W. de Klerk. Botha had to leave. And this individual was expected by most people to be more severe, more reactionary than had any government up to that point. And yet, one of the first acts was one of forgiveness. He pardoned Nelson Mandela. And that kind of started a snowballing of forgiveness in which the ANC, the African National Congress, forgave the apartheid government. The apartheid government released hundreds of other prisoners, which they had kept, most of them for life, many as Mandela in solitary confinement. Such that 4 years later, that happened in 1990, by 1994, there were elections. Probably the most democratic elections in the whole history of the continent of Africa up to that point. And Mandela was elected president. And that wasn't the end of the story. That other institution that we had envisaged, the plans for it were developed further by the South African government. And within a year, Desmond Tutu was named commissioner of a new commission called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which was a court system in which, as we had envisaged, individuals who had committed crimes but wanted to be forgiven and were willing to describe in detail the nature of their crime in the face of the victims or the victim's family. And of course, there were judges, and if the application was judged to be sincere and the revelation of all of the crime had been made, that pardon was given, forgiveness took place. It lasted for 2 years. It was so successful that it's been imitated now by 17 other countries, 18 actually. I just learned Canada has instituted a Truth and Reconciliation Commission regarding their dealings with the Eskimos and the Indians in the north of Canada. But to me, this was kind of the fulfillment of a dream. This is a legal structure based on the essential element of love, forgiveness. And it worked. It operated in terms of bringing together. And you can, PBS did some interesting programs on this. And you can see these heartrending accounts of individuals genuinely seeking forgiveness and receiving it not only from the court, but often from the victim's family. I've spoken of the relationship of this whole process of forgiveness and love, learning how to love, because I think that's basically what forgiveness is, and healing. This was something that was a part of a discovery that Mary Baker Eddy made a little after the middle of the 19th century. And it's one which, for her, was a real breakthrough. It took place right in the middle of her life. She lived to be 90. This was the age of 45. In 1866, she made what she considered this breakthrough, which was an identification of a dimension of healing that Jesus was teaching to his disciples, and of which, as I've described, this use of spiritual sense is a key factor. She made the breakthrough, and as a kind of scientist, I'm saying this because her whole mental approach was one of recognizing this isn't something supernatural. This isn't something beyond our comprehension. And if it can be understood, this healing method, then it can be communicated. But first of all, she needed to test it. And so she did. In the very first year after what she considered the breakthrough that she'd made, she described it as the falling apple, referring to Newton's breakthrough. She was able to heal as she sought this understanding of what Jesus was doing, how to use spiritual sense. And in the very first year of her testing this, she was able to heal a case of cancer, a case of clubfoot, a case of tuberculosis, just quite a number of healings. But this wasn't sufficient. She knew that, okay, she was able to understand, but she needed to be able to demonstrate this wasn't some special ability that she had. It's something that anyone could learn. And so she took a student, an individual. As for Jesus, Jesus' students were not the intellectual elite of his day. They were simple fishermen. And so with her, her first student was a simple worker in a shoe factory. And she worked with him, teaching him what she had understood of this dimension of healing that Jesus was teaching his own students, and he was able to heal. And this kind of began a process. People started looking for this healing, and she recognized that in order to respond to this need, she could train others. She trained individuals who, in the Christian Science religion, there isn't any clergy, but there is a position called practitioner, and this is an individual who, on a full-time basis, makes him or herself available for healing. Healing of not just physical, but all kinds of problems. Marital, financial, educational, work problems, so forth. The process kind of continued to build up, and there was a need to not only train practitioners, but then train teachers who could train practitioners. And after 20 years, she began sending teachers out to different large cities in the world. A large number of them congregated in New York City. And within this context, conflict arose. As it turned out, there was one of these teachers who felt that Mary Baker Eddy was the overall leader, but she was a kind of sub-leader and needed to kind of dominate all the teachers in the New York City area. And there was real severe reaction. One of the people who was really upset was a woman named Laura Lathrop. And I'd like to read to you just a few sentences from a letter that Mary Baker Eddy wrote to Laura Lathrop. This was 1890. Because I think this shows not only the mental approach of forgiveness, but also the behavior that is a necessary consequence of changing one's mental attitude towards the person that you're to forgive. She says, "You have entered the straight and narrow path that leads to bliss, eternal, ever-unfolding love. Oh, press on, darling. Never look back. Love all, underlined. Overcome evil with good. Bless them that do not feel like blessing you. Oh, love all, everyone, and especially, underlined, especially love your enemy, if you have one on earth. Do good to them that know not how to do themselves good. Help them to know." Then later she says, "Go to Mrs. Stetson." That's the kind of charismatic troublemaker. "Go to Mrs. Stetson, put your arms around her neck, tell her how you feel. Oh, love one another, even as Jesus the Christ hath loved you." And she ends it with, "I thank my Father for your new birth." Well, that was for Laura Lathrop a new birth. And I love that combination of the mental attitude with the natural human action that flows from forgiveness. The problem itself lasted a few years further, but for Laura Lathrop, that was the solution. And I'd like to fast forward now 100 years. So we're 1990. In the middle of a family, the wife is a Christian Scientist. She's used Christian Science as a basis for healing. She's been married for 20 years, has 4 children, and is really very confident in her ability to use an understanding of that spiritual sense as the basis of healing. When she learns that her husband not only has been unfaithful as a mistress, but has been unfaithful for the whole 20 years of her marriage. It's a shock. She has a heart attack. Part of her side is paralyzed. Her left arm is unmovable. And as a Christian Scientist, as someone who has used the science consistently and found it effective, good basis for healing, she calls a practitioner. And explaining to him the situation, he responds with, "Well, my dear, of course you must begin by forgiving your husband and his mistress." What? Who's the victim here? Susan doesn't react very well. knows that that Christian Science is effective and that she can use it to heal. So she thanks the practitioner and takes the case on her own. And uses essentially the spiritual sense that I've described in the way that I've described as a basis of identifying herself and seeing herself as God's creation, seeing herself as the constant manifestation of divine love. Feeling a bit uncomfortable, there's kind of mentally knocking at her mental door that idea of betrayal and even harassment. The mistress sends back all the letters that she's received, sends them to Susan, and even contacts her eldest son at one point. Susan feels that maybe she should call the police, but then feels, no, that's not the right thing. And continues to pray, to see herself in these spiritual terms. And the paralysis gets worse. It begins creeping up into her cheek. Her arm, which has not been used now for months, loses a large part of its dimension. And these weeks that become months, that become just a longer period of time, she realizes something has to change. And it's one day when she's realizing that she's working with universal laws. It's a science. And as a science is applicable to everyone. And she realizes that she can't see this as true for herself and not for her husband. That she's seeing herself spiritually. She needs to see her husband in exactly the same way. It's a universal law, and his mistress. And as she does so, the paralysis begins to disappear. And she realizes that consciousness, that she's working with the science, and that the universality of the laws of that science are a crucial element of its nature. The law is true for everyone, and then she sees its application both to herself and to her husband. And as she works with this, she realizes that she has to come to the point where she can love not the human identity of her husband, but his spiritual, his real identity. And this begins to feel comfortable. As that's the case, she's able to move her arm. This was 28 years ago. Today, she's quite an athlete. They did have a divorce, amicable, and she became a Christian Science practitioner. Now, I've described these three levels of conflict resolution, especially as based on consciousness, on what we're thinking. And I hope I've shown that we're not working so much to change elements as to bring into consciousness an accurate understanding of the nature of man, of the nature of the laws that are governing us. And I hope I've suggested some thoughts which you can maybe grab onto. I've attended talks, they're usually not called thinks, but at least of one sort or another. And I've often thought that there were some ideas that I could take from those and consciously put into practice. And for that reason, well, I didn't mention what usually happens after I've made that conscious decision. Let's see, it's Monday afternoon, almost evening. This is a full evening I have tomorrow. I'll be able to put it into practice at least at tomorrow noon. Oh no, I have an appointment. And eventually, despite my good intentions, it doesn't take place. For that reason, I want to give you a challenge that I hope you take. And that is, we live in a world in which we don't hate people. That's politically incorrect to even talk about. So choose the individual in your thinking whom you love the least. and use what I've suggested today with regard to spiritual forgiveness to forgive that individual. And I know that pure as all of us are, there are individuals like this that exist in our thinking, and that I think, well, I'm convinced that using some of these techniques, just a mental redefinition, can be wonderfully helpful. So I hope you take the challenge. And in any case, I want to thank you tremendously for your listening this afternoon. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks very much. As I mentioned, we have, I think, let's see, Cliff, we have to be out by midnight, right? We do have at least 5 or more minutes if there are any questions. And I love questions.
So we have one from Margaret online, and the question was, how can you love the shooters of innocent black men or innocent school children with guns?
How can you love the shooters of innocent black men and school children? And that's a very important question, because what I've described, and this is why I made that distinction between the human forgiveness, which, as I indicated, is wonderful, to be grateful that that's a part of our world that people are emphasizing, and spiritual forgiveness. As I've described the spiritual forgiveness, it's one in which, and I know this may sound a little strange, but we're not dealing with humans. We're dealing with spiritual ideas of God. We're dealing with divine creations. And this is a wonderful distinction that I think is tremendously helpful. It's not always the easiest, but just because we live in a world in which that distinction is rarely made, the distinction between human and purely spiritual. But it's a distinction that is crucial to Jesus. He's constantly reminding his own students, be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. Part of the Sermon on the Mount. He's identifying something which is not human, but which is characteristic of every single idea of God, every one of us. Namely, that's our spiritual identity. Now, it doesn't mean that we don't have to deal with the human. And again, in this Sermon on the Mount, he makes that wonderfully clear statement, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. So that's seeking to understand spiritually what's going on at the purely spiritual level, and all these things shall be added unto you, the questions of nourishment, clothing, and so forth. So there's a distinction that we make between the purely spiritual and the human. We don't ignore the human, but mentally, the conflict resolution that I've been talking about takes place in this spiritual consciousness. And that's why I emphasized the need to understand that spiritual sense that we're using. Okay, all of this to say that we would not think of pardoning crimes. That's something that takes the dealing with crimes is something which takes place at the human level, and it's something that's very important to maintain at the highest degree of integrity and clarity. So what I'm talking about really is prayer. It's seeing spiritually what is true. And from that standpoint, as I suggested, we can deconstruct those individuals who have, at the human dimension, committed crimes, sometimes heinous crimes. But if we're going to rise to the point where we're able to forgive them, we're going to be able to see their spiritual identity. So there's a distinction. And the forgiveness takes place at that spiritual level, not at the human level. I hope that's clear. Yes?
Being the Easter season, Jesus' forgiveness of the Romans who were murdering him seems an important answer to this person's question. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yes, I think that's a good.
It was an enormously healing thought that enabled him to ascend eventually.
Good.
John, do you mind repeating that, the online post? What you said?
Yes, this was the statement that Jesus makes with regard to those who were crucifying him. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. And there's at that level, and this is I think something that we could add here. What he's operating at the human level, because forgive them, for they know not what they do. He's acknowledging them. He's acknowledging that they are not really conscious of the horrible crime that they're committing. And again, this sense of the importance of lifting it to a higher level is crucial here, because to the degree that we're able to use our spiritual sense to identify accurately, see the statement he's making is a human one. And if we're going to reach the real point of forgiveness, then we're going to be able to see that those Roman soldiers have a spiritual identity. And we're going to kind of eliminate the whole historical picture of them and see their divine nature.
Would you say that this is synonymous to if someone dreams that someone has harmed them and wakes up, that forgiving them is sort of like seeing that was just a dream?
Well, that's an interesting metaphor. But, if they have been harmed in their dream by someone and then waking up and seeing that they're whole and that whole thing was a dream, I think that's a wonderful way to deal with it. And it's a metaphor that Mary Baker Eddy uses, that is that of the dream, because it's something from which we need to awaken. That is, and it's essentially the whole world that we learn about through our physical senses. Gradually, we need to free ourselves from that, and seeing it as a dream that from which we can awaken is very helpful. Exactly.
Do you have any ideas for a conflict resolution when one party wants to resolve and the other one does not?
Ideas of a conflict resolution where one of the individuals is seeking resolution and the other doesn't. This is a realm where I think there's a consciousness of essentially God's guidance that comes in. Part of the reason why I chose that example of the at the community level was because I love the ability of the city councilor, whom I hated so intensely, to change, and to expect that that's something like that. We don't really try to mentally force that. We don't say, okay, I'm going to, pray that person changes in this particular way. But there is a consequence of the prayer in which we've used our spiritual sense, in this case, accurately to identify that individual. I'm sure he was touched by that. And that kind of transformation is something that we should expect. So that in cases where an individual says, no, I'm not interested in in participating in a reconciliation, that the change can come about. And again, that was clearly the case with there were lots of other pressures that were put on the South African government, but I'm sure that there was a degree to which that pardon that de Klerk gave to Mandela, and then to many, many others, was a result of prayer. And you can see this, there's some wonderful accounts of the actions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which de Klerk himself comes with a request for pardon, because he knows he's been involved in illegal activities. And this is part of the healing, actually, that's taking place still today in South Africa. And I say that I came back just a few days ago from South Africa, and I'll just share this in parentheses because to me it's wonderful news. I was able to speak with an individual who is a lawyer and for whom Mariposa was a clerk, so he knew him very well, and that individual is a Christian Scientist, and the forecast that he made with regard to the future of South Africa under Mariposa was wonderful, and involves, interestingly enough, just because there's constant forgiveness that's taking place in South Africa, resolving the terrible inequalities and injustices that accumulated over generations. Even though this is, 24 years later, there's still a lot of healing that's going on. Yes?
You've spoken so eloquently about how forgiveness improves relationships and lifts the forgivee, so to speak, but I think about something Mrs. Eddy said in something I read, where she said, if I wanted to really hurt someone, I would have them hate me. So you could almost think of forgiveness as a selfish act in a way.
Absolutely, yes.
I don't mean that in a negative sense.
Yes, no. I think it's absolutely true. And this is something that medical people and psychiatrists have acknowledged, that resentment, hatred destroys the resenter and the hater. Pardon?
Hate is poison.
Hate is poison. Yes. And Mandela said something to the effect that about eating. I don't remember, so I won't quote it exactly. But yes, this is. It's a way of freeing ourselves, and the freedom. There are degrees of the freedom. No longer having the resentment is already a tremendous freedom. But the freedom of being able to identify the individual as a creation of God, and to be able to love that individual, that is just sort of magnificent. That's what it's kind of the resurrection. It frees us from so many other things that it's health-giving in the fullest sense of that term. Last question. Yes?
What about spiritual forgiveness on the highways home tonight, since you mentioned it?
What about spiritual forgiveness on the highways home? I think the highways have become a place where forgiveness is increasingly required. So that's a realm. Let me just suggest, though, that this approach that our country needs, what I've suggested is the spiritual forgiveness, and that if we can, just for ourselves, within this context of political polarization, if we can come to the point where we've done what I've suggested, pushed aside the physical picture, pushed aside the historical facade, and now we can see the real spiritual identity of those guys that we've identified as the troublemakers or the horrible evildoers. Mentally push that completely aside and accurately identify the divine nature of those individuals. If we can see them, we have as our goal the ability to love, to see that, excuse me for just this one extra comment. There's this, and this is another example of how Jesus was emphasizing the importance of spiritual sense to his students. On the eve of the crucifixion, he has a discussion with his students, and he's explained to them that he's going to be leaving them, and they're going to, he wants to make sure that they're not losing their joy. And Thomas, not the brightest of Jesus' students, pipes up and asks, well, what's going to happen? And Jesus explained, he'd already explained to them, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He that hath seen the Father hath seen me. And then Philip, one of the better of Jesus' students, we're beyond the edge. Okay. But anyway, then Philip pipes up and says, show us the Father. And then Jesus loses it. And the most heartrending statement comes out that, have I been so long time with you, Philip, and thou hast not known me? He that hath seen me hath seen the Father. Well, that's the goal. You see, he's been training them to see not just himself, each of God's creations as the image and likeness, as God. So there we have the goal, to come to that point of spiritual forgiveness where you're able to sense the divine nature, the picture of God. And that's a real challenge. But you see, if you've reached that point, then loving that individual just is the most natural thing in the world. You've been wonderful. Thank you so much.